So now we're here in Substance Painter, and I'm not going to go over the menu options, the buttons, the interface things, because honestly, you guys can find videos for free that go into that stuff way better than I want to. So instead, let's talk about more of the artistic principles. Again, this whole course is about techniques, so I'll show you what a good workflow looks like, and then I'll let you decide whether or not Substance is something you want to use for your projects. Okay, so start off by going to File, New. I have version 2 on the skull, and I'm going to set the document resolution here to 2048. Now the first step in all this is to bake out mesh maps. And if we go here to the texture set settings and we scroll down, we have bake mesh maps, and we have a few different options. Now I can already tell you that when it comes to ambient occlusion, this one is probably the most visually important map that you're going to bake. And instead of doing that here in Substance, I'm going to show you how to do that within Houdini because we'll get a much better result. But I do think it's nice to bake out the rest of these maps. So let's go to the common settings right here, change the map resolution to 2048, go down to anti-aliasing, set that to 4x4. That'll just increase the quality by a little bit. Let's turn off ID, that's not necessary. And also for right now, turn off the ambient occlusion. Once we have all this, we'll just bake 1001 mesh maps, and we're off. Now for baking the ambient occlusion. Here we have the skull. I'm going to set a new material, and we're going to create a new shader that's just ambient occlusion. So for the group, we'll say everything, and we need to go to the material context, and I already have this AO material shader ready to go. Except now we need to add RSAO and set that to the out surface. Just like that. Okay, so back to the geometry again, material. Let's go find that AO shader right there. Set the visibility to material 1. And then when it comes to our lights, let's highlight everything, turn them off, and then turn on this temporary HDR and get rid of the dome map so that we don't have any lighting information except for just a perfectly blank white sphere. So we'll go like that. Now if we go to out, we have our redshift ROP, and if we go to render maps, this will allow us to bake out everything that's going to the UVs into a texture map with ambient occlusion. So say bake render map right there. UV is called UV. The output resolution is 2048 by 2048. And let's then go to the outputs and tell this to go to our HIP. We'll make a substance folder right there. And then we also have a ref folder that you'll want to make. Let's make a new folder within here called skull. And I'll call this our skull underscore AO underscore 2k.exr. Okay, so now we're going to make an EXR file. Before I forget, let's be sure that if we go to Redshift on the settings that we have a max samples to 2048. That'll prevent the ambient occlusion from getting too grainy. And also if we go to our render maps, be sure that skull is the only thing that's being selected when it goes to find the object. Once we have all that, we'll then render to disk, and that should give us what we need. Now that we're back here in Substance, we can take that map that we just baked out, and we can apply that to the mesh. So let's make a fill layer with this paint bucket, isolate the color for right now, and then drag over the new map. And if you have this file, you could just drag the file over to this area and then import that as a texture. So anyway, this is what the ambient occlusion looks like. It's pretty nice. It emphasizes the form quite a bit. So if we look at a before and after, that makes a pretty significant difference. Also, we can sort through the different channels by pressing C. So this is the base color channel, and this will show us exactly what that redshift render gave us. Now you'll notice that there's a few areas on the skull that are kind of messing up, like right here, for example, and inside the nose. And that has to do with overlapping UVs. What I've found is that this artifact will show up whether you're using Houdini or Modo, or I tried a couple of other things as well, but it just seems to be part of this mesh. For some reason, the auto UV algorithms don't like it very much. So anyway, it's actually not a very big deal. There were a few spots that I touched up manually with the UVs. I just selected some faces and projected. But for the most part, we're going to see the skull from back here. It's not going to make a huge difference, honestly. And if we really want to, we can also paint over some of these spots that are more important. So as an example, I can right click here and say add paint. Then I can use the eyedropper to, let's say, sample a color right there. Control right mouse is the brush right there. If we if we go down here to this alignments in the brush settings and we set that to UV, we can then paint some of these areas. You'll notice that again, we're kind of going with this overlapped UV stuff here, so it's not perfect. But if there's an area that's too annoying, we can always go and just do something along these lines, and that should do the trick well enough. Okay, so anyway, we have that, and I think so far we are looking generally pretty good, besides that overlapping UV thing. Another useful map to bake out might be the curvature map. So if we go here back to our shader, you use this curvature setting right here. I set this to convex, and I set the radius down a little bit. And after baking that out, if we then go to substance, and let me find that real quick. So if we go shading techniques, and we go to, I believe it was substance, ref, skull. We now have edges right here, texture, and I'm going to import this just for the current session. So now, if we create a new fill layer, our edges look like this. If you go to the base color, there we go. So you might be able to get a better signal with the edges by baking that out from Redshift as well. It's all personal preference. If you like the baking here in Substance, you can do that. Or you can bake it out by rendering within Houdini. My advice is that if you're using something that's GPU based, like Redshift, Arnold, V-Ray, basically any GPU render engine, it's worth the time to just render it out inside of Houdini because you'll probably get a better results. However, if you don't have a GPU render like Mantra, then I would recommend just baking things out within Substance Painter because it's really not worth your time to wait for, like a 10-20 minute render whenever you're baking out these signals. You want to save yourself enough time so you don't want it to be too much of a hassle, and we also want a nice looking signal so that when we go to apply masks or whenever we go to try to emphasize form and things like that, you're working with better ingredients. In the very least, it's something to think about and keep in mind when it comes to determining your workflow. So anyway, that's how you might go about baking some texture maps. This method also applies to any other painting application that you have. So the nice thing about baking things in Houdini is that your workflow doesn't change if you decide to go to a different painting app for whatever reason. Also in Houdini, if you have a lot of these bakes that you need to do, maybe one good way of doing that is through the take system. So you make a separate take, which makes all the right shader assignments and lights available to you. That might be a good way of doing it. It might also be easier to just create a separate scene that's dedicated just for baking, and then you can just copy paste your geo networks and, temporarily bring in the geo, bake out the maps you need, and just have that scene set to the side so that it's ready to go whenever you want to bake something. Those are both workflow options that you could use if you decide to bake here in Houdini. Otherwise, you can also keep it simple in Substance, but I don't think the results will look as good. In the next video, let's talk about some of the artistic considerations when it comes to the skull. We have to make decisions on what direction we want to go with the style, the aesthetic choices. I'll talk about a few things when it comes to that, and then we'll get to painting out some features.